Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a country that feels almost hidden, right there in the vibrant heart of South America, often overshadowed by its giant neighbors.
Hmm.
It's Paraguay, a place some people might even, question the existence of.
Right.
Physically, it's shaped uniquely, almost like a letter Y, split between the higher, rolling hills in the east and the vast, wild, sometimes swampy lowlands of the Grand Chaco out west. You could call it a land of forgotten treasures.
And that's exactly the landscape we're going to navigate today. We've got a substantial stack of sources for this deep dive, covering Paraguay's rich, often turbulent, and definitely complex history and culture.
A lot to cover then.
We're going all the way from its pre-colonial roots, right up through its recent political and environmental challenges.
So our mission is clear: to dive into this material and pull out the absolute key nuggets, the essential insights, so you can quickly get a real handle on a nation whose story is profoundly, even dramatically different from those around it.
Yeah?
Let's get into it.
Let's start right at the foundation of what makes Paraguay, well, Paraguay. These sources highlight that the core of its cultural identity is rooted in a unique blend.
Okay.
A dual language and dual race identity born from the interaction of Spanish and Guarani influences.
And the sources really explore that deep, unique Guarani worldview. They describe it as having this incredible connection to nature and the spiritual realm.
Right. It's fascinating.
The Guarani saw everything: plants, animals, the land itself caught up in this complex net of invisible forces.
Powerful forces.
These forces were seen as potent, retaining, transmitting, and even augmenting power, affecting people both physically and spiritually. It wasn't just abstract. This belief permeated everything: their daily life principles, rituals, music, festivals,
How they built their homes.
how they built their homes, even the simple objects they created. It was all about trying to live in harmony with nature and, in a way, imitate or even remake its powerful forces.
Right. And the physical landscape itself, while rich in potential resources like rivers for transport, abundant timber, and fertile soil, it presented a real challenge for early human settlement.
How so?
The sources talk about the intense heat and dangerous wild animals, making it initially intimidating, almost like a kind of desert in terms of widespread exploitation before the Spanish truly established a foothold.
So the Spanish show up in the 1500s, poking around, trying to get a handle on the place. But as you mentioned, that daunting environment, the heat, the wildlife, it really was a deterrence.
Yeah, it slowed things down.
The sources say it slowed down significant settlement for about 20 years.
And that's precisely the context where the Jesuit missionaries became so pivotal. They arrived in the late 16th and 17th centuries and played a massive role.
Ah, the Jesuits.
Right. Their approach, described in the sources, involved gathering indigenous people, primarily Guarani, into organized communities. These are known as the reductions.
Reductions, okay.
The sources suggest their method was relatively non-violent compared to some other colonizers, focusing on using the labor of the Guarani within these settlements. They founded key missions that are still historically significant, like San Gabriel, Santa Maria de Fe, and San Juan Bautista.
They became incredibly powerful, didn't they? The sources highlight their versatility. They weren't just religious figures.
No.
They acted as lawyers and judges, helped negotiate peace treaties, increased their participation in administration, and by around 1640 had even gained significant control over large territories through special permissions from the Pope. Papal bulls, right?
Exactly. And this growing influence, this blend of religious authority, economic control over the reductions, and political savvy, inevitably created major rivalries.
Makes sense.
Not just with the Spanish crown, which became wary of their power, but also with other religious orders like the Franciscans and the Rosary priests, who were competing for control over these same lucrative Guarani settlements.
So infighting, too.
Oh, yes. But even with all their power, the sources note that internal indigenous revolts and patterns of native resistance did manage to disrupt and thwart some of their grand initiatives. It wasn't a simple takeover.
All these competing forces, Spanish colonial rule, Jesuit power, and underlying indigenous realities eventually set the stage for independence. Paraguay declared independence in 1811.
A key moment.
The sources tell us this wasn't a smooth process. It kicked off what they call a tumultuous period. A key driver here was Paraguay's defiance of being subordinate to Buenos Aires, which had been made the chief port by earlier Spanish reforms. Paraguayan cattle ranchers, for instance, preferred doing their own local trade thing.
Exactly. This defiance, coupled with a deep-seated resentment of being ruled from Buenos Aires and memories of Spanish brutality, really fueled the independence movement. And in the middle of this emerges José Gaspar Rodríguez de Francia.
El Supret.
The sources describe his rise. He played a crucial role in the revolutionary phase, and by 1814 had consolidated power to become the supreme leader, effectively eliminating all other competing authorities.
This period saw a strong sense of nationalism develop. The sources point out that this often blurred the lines between Argentina, the country, and Buenos Aires, the city.
Right, they were often conflated.
Partly driven by failed invasion attempts by Argentina, which sparked resentment and led to a significant number of wealthier Argentines leaving Paraguay.
And the consequences of Francia's rule were profound and lasting. From 1814 onwards, Paraguay became almost entirely cut off from the outside world for nearly a quarter of a century.
25 years.
One source vividly describes this as a satirized state of affairs. What they mean is that the economy stagnated, development was deferred, and things seemed to decay, almost literally. They quote Johann de Witt from 1825 saying, "In some towns, rust and lichen alone grow over the shiny marine copper. Countries devoid of money, energy, and visibility do not boast or brag." It really paints a picture of that extreme isolation and its effect.
Wow, cut off from the world for 25 years.
Yeah.
So what was the economy like during that period, this intractable and exclusive time until 1840, as the sources call it?
Well, the focus was heavily on sugar production, strangely enough.
Sugar in isolation.
Yeah, the regulations around it were confusing. The Spanish crown had supposedly prohibited it since 1816, but either they made a specific exception for Paraguay or black market trade just flourished unchecked. The sources have differing interpretations there.
Okay.
What is clear is that Francia's regime ran it as a strict monopoly, controlling everything from supply to production.
Just state control.
Total state control. This created trade issues and even sparked protests from other regions. Trade was minimal. Only a limited number of vessels, maybe 5 to 15 a year, came in, mostly crewed by locals. And critically, the sources note, the absence of large-scale planters meant there was a real lack of capacity for refining the sugar.
So that isolation couldn't last forever. In the mid-19th century, under leaders like Carlos Antonio Lopez,
Francia's successor,
and later his son, Francisco Solano Lopez, who we'll hear more about, the sources describe a shift. There was a return to a more open economy, trade resumed, and they talk about this leading to real economic growth and industrialization.
Exactly. This was a period of significant change. Remittances returning from abroad became a crucial source of public revenue.
Ah, so money coming back in.
Yes. They stimulated a new banking system through legislation. And there was real industrialization, not just exporting raw goods, but transforming domestic products.
Like what?
The sources highlight the adoption of technological innovation like steam engines and cotton mills and sawmills, replacing manual labor and boosting productivity.
Steam engines, okay.
Agriculture boomed too, making Paraguay a leading cotton producer in the southern hemisphere and competitive in palm oil exports, partly because it grew near waterways, which kept transportation costs down.
And this period of growth, this opening up, leads us to a pivotal moment. Here's where it gets really interesting, but also incredibly tragic.
Yeah, this is a major turning point.
All these internal and external pressures escalated into the War of the Triple Alliance, starting in 1864. Territorial disputes with neighbors were simmering.
The trigger, according to the sources, was President Francisco Solano Lopez declaring war on Brazil over a dispute about river access and taxes.
A river tax dispute escalates to war.
Seems that way. Brazil responded by invading. Then, Lopez made a critical miscalculation, declaring war on Argentina. This led to Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay forming the Triple Alliance and launching a devastating invasion from multiple fronts.
The consequences laid out in these sources are just horrific. It wasn't just a military conflict.
No, it was total war.
It was a full-blown humanitarian catastrophe, total economic collapse, social fabric destruction, and a simply devastating loss of life. The sources estimate nearly 90% of Paraguayan males between 15 and 50 died, perhaps even more.
It's almost unimaginable, 90%.
But it's staggering.
The significance of this war, as the sources emphasize, cannot be overstated. It's described as the only known instance in post-colonial Americas where larger, wealthier nations actively attempted to eradicate a smaller, poorer neighbor.
Eradicate, that's strong language.
That's how the sources frame it, the outcome. Brazil and Argentina grew wealthier, while Paraguay was left what one source describes as a failed state, a stark illustration of uneven power distribution on the continent.
Wow.
This war didn't just end, it created a great void at the very core of Paraguayan identity, leaving behind deep trauma, unease, suspicion, and lingering resentment. It's the memory of a mass slaughter that, from the source's perspective, lacks any rational or proportionate justification.
Trying to reconstruct anything after that level of devastation must have been immensely challenging. The basic industries were wiped out.
Yeah.
There was no money, no experience to rebuild. The sources mention that initially Lopez and a small group of associates tightly controlled the meager resources and the remnants of administration.
Right. Power concentrated very quickly.
And to maintain control, the police force was reshaped into an instrument of terror, disrupting communication and heavily taxing what little trade existed.
Yes, a brutal and difficult period of survival. Fast forward a few decades, and Paraguay is embroiled in another conflict, the Chaco War from 1932 to 1935, this time with Bolivia over disputed territory in the western Chaco region.
The Chaco War. Less famous, maybe.
Less widely known internationally than the Triple Alliance War, but hugely significant internally. Paraguay, surprisingly, won against a larger Bolivian force, gaining a substantial amount of land.
A surprising victory. Did that change things internally?
That war also seems to have triggered a major internal political shift, according to the sources. They note it marked the end of what they describe as a kind of communal state.
Communal state. What does that mean exactly?
The sources aren't entirely explicit, but it suggests a shift away from maybe older, more collective structures towards a more centralized modern state, but with a dark side. The country then attempted to modernize, but the practical consequence was the rise of military power and brutal dictatorial repression of any political opposition.
So modernization came with repression.
Hand in hand, it seems. The Colorado Party gained ascendancy, becoming dominant, but the promised civil liberties were largely reserved for the elite. Meanwhile, the sources point out that Guarani speakers, the majority population, remained largely subjugated, often living in freehold colonies controlled by powerful landowners.
Right, so the benefits weren't widely shared.
Not at all. That pattern of instability and power, concentrated among elites, landowners, the military, and the Colorado Party, characterized much of the 20th century. The sources describe it as a series of power shifts, often accompanied by violence, fueled by export revenues, and, as one source puts it, American financing for retail oligarchs.
Retail oligarchs. Interesting term. We see this play out in specific episodes the sources mention, like a notable clash involving President Paraguayo Cubas.
Yes, that was a chaotic period.
Congress declared officials unfit, the military stepped in naming a president, there were offers of intervention from Brazil and Argentina, and ultimately General Santos led a coup, suspending the constitution.
And this era of instability culminated in the notoriously long Stroessner dictatorship, which lasted from 1954 to 1989.
Decades.
35 years. The sources characterize it as a regime of systematic and far-reaching political repression, marked by attempts to maintain power through purges and suppression of dissent. Its foreign policy was largely defensive and aligned with the U.S. during the Cold War.
Right, the Cold War context.
While there was propaganda painting it as a military government in transit to democracy, the reality, as the sources make clear, was brutal repression.
The propaganda machine really mythologized Stroessner, portraying him as this almost omniscient, enlightened despot who supposedly knew everyone.
Yeah, this carefully constructed image.
But this was a stark contrast to the reality of the purges and repression, described as a construct built on propaganda and a kind of social amnesia, tied to a utopian vision of modernizing the country through state control.
The transition finally came in 1989, led by General Andrés Rodriguez. The sources framed this event complexly. It was a coup that removed Stroessner, who went into exile.
But not just a coup.
Well, it's also described as having elements of a popular uprising. Paraguay then entered its democratic cycle in a unique way, without a typical slow transitional period, stepping into a political vacuum, but with a widespread desire to move past the trauma.
Understandable desire.
However, that trauma of repression, torture, assassination, exile was very real and personally affected many families.
It sounds like even articulating resistance during the dictatorship was incredibly difficult, almost described as a resounding silence.
Yeah, fear was pervasive.
But Rodriguez's initial regime did take steps to investigate and try to understand the pervasive fear that had defined those decades.
So when we look at Paraguay today, how do these deep historical currents, especially the Triple Alliance War and the long dictatorship, continue to shape its reality.
Still relevant then.
The sources suggest they are absolutely central, contributing to persistent issues like weakened democratic institutions, widespread corruption, and the enduring influence of powerful elites. One source even describes the current situation as a criminalized political order.
That's a strong statement. And you see this reflected in major contemporary challenges like environmental issues.
Definitely. The sources highlight rapid deforestation, particularly since World War II.
And that's linked to.
This isn't just random. It's primarily driven by the expansion of agribusiness to meet external demand. Soy, cattle.
Yeah.
The impact on quality of life is severe, and the sources credibly link it to human rights abuses, growing social unrest, and even armed conflict over land.
Conflict over land driven by deforestation.
Yes. Economically, there's a massive dependency on hydroelectric energy, particularly from the Itaipu Dam, completed in 1977.
Itaipu, the huge dam shared with Brazil.
Exactly. While it's generated an energy boom, it's widely seen by Paraguayans, according to the sources, as a prime example of massive corruption, bribery, and embezzlement involving officials colluding with corporations.
So the benefits aren't seen locally.
There's a strong perception that the benefits are channeled away, often towards Brazil, at Paraguay's expense. One source frames this as economic expropriation, particularly salient around the election of a left-leaning president who challenged the status quo.
Economic expropriation. And the health system, how does that fit in?
Well, while structured on paper with public, private, and social security options, it faces significant problems on the ground. The sources point to qualitative issues like corruption, staff shortages, lack of supplies, and critically, high out-of-pocket payments for citizens, suggesting the state isn't investing in it as much as the design implies.
Despite all these hurdles, there's a strong sense of cultural resilience. The sources emphasize the survival and even revival of traditional music and dance, deeply rooted in indigenous origins.
Absolutely. Culture finds a way.
The Triple Alliance War was a brutal interruption that severely impacted this for decades, but efforts to restore and celebrate these traditions continue today. The Paraguayan harp, in particular, is highlighted as the national instrument. Its introduction dates back to the Spanish conquest, but it's been uniquely adopted and developed in Paraguay.
A beautiful instrument.
The sources mention renowned harpists, both historical figures like Vicente de la Cruz and contemporary ones such as Pedro Tadeo Zappa, Manuel Ortiz Guerrero, and Higinio Lima Ledesma.
What's quite striking, according to the sources, is the complex relationship with indigenous music itself. Despite the deep Guarani roots of Paraguayan culture and the fact that highly developed indigenous music styles existed pre-Europeans, and some practices still continue, Paraguayan researchers have shown a surprising tendency to neglect the study of indigenous music genres.
Really? Why would that be?
The sources raise the question of whether this is due to lingering ethnocentric attitudes or perhaps specific biases in academic training. It's a bit of a puzzle.
Cultural expression also found ways to survive and develop even during the hardest times. Political exiles, for instance, nurtured and developed their culture abroad.
Yes, exile communities were vital.
And after the dictatorship, described as a period of cruel silencer for the arts, there have been significant efforts to restart and revitalize arts and music. The sources mention Alberto Castro's important book on Paraguayan music, notably written while he was in exile.
The literary tradition is also part of this cultural landscape. Patricio de Oriarbit is mentioned as a key early author. And the use and representation of the Guarani language in literature is a fascinating complexity.
The language itself.
While Paraguayans continued to communicate in Guarani after independence, published texts in the language were scarce for a period. General Francisco Solano Lopez himself is even present in the literary tradition, appearing in popular ballads.
Interesting. And finally, one particularly interesting cultural trait noted in the sources. Paraguayans are often seen and see themselves as a very happy people.
Known for it, apparently.
Known throughout South America for what's described as excessive cheerfulness. This is often reflected in their music and theater figures, like Julio Cordero, known as the national clown. The sources link this trait to their fanciful nature and perhaps even the influence of the tropical heat.
Looking outward, the sources discuss Paraguay's global connections. Historically, there was a tendency towards isolationism.
Back to isolationism.
Sometimes seen as rooted in a degree of xenophobia, or even a conviction of cultural superiority, which paradoxically created economic vulnerabilities that neighbors exploited.
But this contrasts with more recent engagement. Paraguay was a founding member of regional organizations like the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB, and has actively secured funding for projects.
Right, there's been a shift.
It's also been part of coalitions of democratic countries.
To sum up the source's perspective on the future, there's been remarkable progress over the last 30 years, especially considering the immense historical hurdles and expansion of civil liberties, greater integration into the global economy.
So positive signs?
Yes, but this is tempered by ongoing economic roadblocks, persistent weakening of democratic institutions, rampant corruption, and what the sources call a criminalized political order.
Still major challenges.
They note the complex impact of structural adjustment policies, often linked to the Washington Consensus, which didn't prevent financial crises and regression, and some argue even put democratic order at risk to benefit a narrow few.
What an incredible journey through a history that is clearly not well known enough. We've taken this deep dive today and uncovered so many layers, from a land defined by its unique geography and indigenous culture, through the complexities of colonial rule and the pivotal Jesuit influence, a really profound period of isolation under Francia, the absolutely devastating trauma of the Triple Alliance War, decades of brutal dictatorship, and the ongoing struggles with corruption, inequality, and environmental challenges.
What really stands out from these sources is the sheer resilience and the truly unique path Paraguay has forged. It's a nation often overlooked or sidelined, but its presence is undeniable, shaped so powerfully by conflict and that deep blending of cultures.
Yeah.
The core elements we discussed, the indigenous and Spanish roots, the demanding geography, the immense scar left by the Triple Alliance War, and the legacy of political instability, these aren't just historical facts. As our sources show, they are living forces actively shaping the country's reality right now.
Given this history of profound trauma, forced isolation, and a continuous difficult struggle between powerful elites and the majority population, what does it truly mean to identify as Paraguayan today? And how does this unique national experience, so different from its neighbors, offer a fundamentally different lens through which we can understand the broader dynamics of South America?
That's the question, isn't it?
That's something worth keeping in mind as you continue exploring.